The knock on the door came sooner than expected, and Elinor Hartley nearly dropped the tray of glasses in her hands. "He is early," her father whispered, straightening his coat for the third time in a minute. "Elinor, please, I beg you, tonight of all nights, mind your tongue." Elinor set the tray down with more force than she intended. "I always mind my tongue, father." "You do not," he said. "You mind it only when it suits you." There was no time to argue. The housemaid, Bridget, was already moving toward the front door, her shoes clicking fast against the wooden floor. Elinor smoothed her skirts and took a breath, trying to calm the strange, nervous energy that had filled the house all afternoon. Her father, Charles Hartley, was a merchant who had built his fortune from nothing but persistence and careful trade. He had spent the last 3 weeks in a state Elinor had never seen before, pacing rooms, checking correspondence twice a day, sending Bridget out to buy the finest cuts of meat the butcher had. He would not say who was coming to dinner. Only that it was a man of great importance, a man who could change the fortunes of their family forever, and that Elinor must, under no circumstance, embarrass him. "Who is he?" Elinor had asked at least a dozen times that week. "You will know soon enough," was all her father would say, each time with the same nervous smile. Elinor did not like secrets, and she liked being told to behave even less. She had grown up watching her father work himself thin trying to please men who barely noticed him, bowing to customers who spoke to him as though he were furniture. She loved her father deeply, but she had never understood why respect had to be earned through submission. She believed a person's character showed in how they treated those who could do nothing for them, not in how they flattered those who could do everything. The door opened, and Bridget's voice carried down the hall, polite and a little breathless. "Good evening, sir. Please come in." Elinor straightened at the top of the stairs, watching through the railing as a man stepped into the entrance hall. He was tall, dressed simply in a dark green coat with no ornament, no rings, nothing that spoke of wealth beyond the quality of the fabric itself. His hair was dark and slightly windblown, as though he had walked rather than taken a carriage. He looked, Elinor thought, like an ordinary gentleman of modest means, not at all like someone who could change a family's fortunes. "Mr. Ashford," her father said, hurrying forward with his hand extended. "Welcome, welcome, we are honored to have you." "Mr. Hartley," the guest replied, his voice cool and clipped. He glanced around the entrance hall the way a man might inspect a horse he was considering buying, his eyes moving over the furniture, the paintings, the modest chandelier above them. "Your home is smaller than I expected." Elinor felt her jaw tighten at the top of the stairs. Her father let out a short, uncomfortable laugh. "We manage well enough, sir. Please let me show you to the drawing room." "I would prefer not to wait long for dinner," Mr. Ashford said. "I have little patience for drawn-out evenings." Elinor came down the stairs slowly, keeping her expression carefully neutral, though inside she was already forming opinions about their guest that she doubted her father would want to hear. She reached the bottom step just as her father turned to introduce her. "Ah, and this is my daughter, Elinor." Mr. Ashford turned to look at her, and for a brief moment something flickered across his face, an expression she could not quite name. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same flat politeness he had shown since walking through the door. "Miss Hartley," he said, with a short bow that seemed more habit than sincerity. "Mr. Ashford," Elinor replied, matching his tone exactly, neither warm nor cold, simply even. "I hope your journey here was pleasant." "It was long," he said, "and the roads outside your part of town are poorly kept." Elinor blinked. It was perhaps the strangest thing to say to someone within the first 10 seconds of meeting them, but she kept her composure. "I shall be sure to mention it to the roads, sir, though I doubt they will listen." For a moment silence hung in the hall. Her father's eyes widened slightly in warning. Then Mr. Ashford's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close to it, before he turned away toward the drawing room without another word. "Elinor," her father hissed under his breath as they followed behind, "what did I say to you not an hour ago?" "I only answered him," she whispered back. "He is the one who complained about the roads as though I built them myself. Please, just tonight, let him say what he wishes and agree." Elinor did not answer, because she did not want to promise something she was not certain she could keep. The drawing room had been prepared with more care than Elinor had ever seen in their home. Fresh flowers sat on the mantel, the good silver had been polished until it gleamed, and even the fire had been built higher than usual, filling the room with warmth. Her father gestured for their guest to sit, and Mr. Ashford lowered himself into the chair nearest the fire without waiting to be told which seat was meant for him. "Might I offer you something to drink, sir?" her father asked. "We have a fine sherry, or if you prefer—" "Whatever is fastest," Mr. Ashford said, not looking up from where he was studying the room. Elinor watched her father's shoulders tense as he moved to pour the drink himself rather than call for Bridget. It struck her as strange, watching her father, a man who had built an entire trading business from nothing, who negotiated with captains and merchants twice his size without flinching, reduced to something small and eager in front of this one guest. She did not understand what power this man held over her father, but she understood enough to know it unsettled her. "You have a lovely home, Mr. Hartley," Mr. Ashford said finally, though his tone did not match the compliment. "Modest but lovely." "Thank you, sir. We do our best with what we have." "I imagine you do." He took the glass her father offered without a word of thanks and drank from it slowly, his eyes moving to Elinor, who had taken a seat across the room near the window. "Your daughter does not speak much." "She speaks plenty, sir," her father said quickly with a nervous laugh, "perhaps too much at times." "I would rather too much than too little," Mr. Ashford said. "Silence tells me nothing about a person. Words at least reveal something, even when a person tries to hide behind them." Elinor met his gaze directly. "And what do my words tell you so far, Mr. Ashford?" Her father made a small strangled sound, but Mr. Ashford only studied her for a long moment before answering. "That you do not care for me," he said simply, "which is unusual, given that most people in this town fall over themselves the moment they learn of my visit." "Perhaps that is because most people know something about you that I do not," Elinor said. "You forget, sir, my father has not told me who you are or why your visit matters so greatly. To me, you are simply a guest who complained about our roads and our home within the same breath of walking through the door." There was a pause long enough that Elinor wondered if she had finally gone too far. Her father looked as though he might faint, but then Mr. Ashford let out a short laugh, low and surprised, as though the sound had escaped him before he could stop it. "Well," he said, "at least you are honest." "I try to be," Elinor said. "It saves a great deal of time." Bridget appeared in the doorway to announce that dinner was ready, and the three of them made their way to the dining room, where the table had been set with more care than Elinor had ever seen. Candles lined the center of the table, their light flickering warmly against the polished wood. Elinor took her seat across from their guest, her father at the head of the table between them, still looking as though he expected the evening to collapse at any moment. The first course arrived, a rich soup that their cook, Mrs. Dobbins, had spent the better part of the afternoon preparing. Elinor had watched her sweating over the stove for hours, determined that everything be perfect for their important guest. She took pride in Mrs. Dobbins' cooking, having grown up eating meals prepared with more love than money could ever buy. Mr. Ashford took one spoonful, set his spoon down, and did not pick it up again. "Is something wrong with the soup, sir?" her father asked, his voice tight with worry. "It is overly salted," Mr. Ashford said simply, as though commenting on the weather, "and rather thin for a first course. I trust your cook does not usually serve guests of importance." Elinor felt something hot rise in her chest. She thought of Mrs. Dobbins standing over the stove, tasting and retasting the soup a dozen times to be sure it was right, worrying aloud that it might not be good enough. She thought of the woman's hands, red and worn from years of work in their kitchen, work that had never once been met with anything but gratitude from their household. "Our cook," Elinor said, her voice steady despite the anger building beneath it, "has worked in this house for 11 years. She rises before dawn and does not rest until well past dark, and in all that time, not one guest has ever complained about her cooking, sir, until tonight." "Elinor," her father said sharply, but she did not stop. "You may find the soup thin, Mr. Ashford, but I find it strange that a man who arrives uninvited into judgment of our home, our roads, and now our cook, has offered nothing in return but complaint. If you find our hospitality so lacking, I wonder why you accepted the invitation at all." The room fell utterly silent. Her father's face had gone pale, his hand frozen halfway to his glass. Bridget, who had been standing near the sideboard, looked as though she wished the floor might open and swallow her whole. Even the candle flame seemed to still. Mr. Ashford sat perfectly motionless, his dark eyes fixed on Elinor with an expression she could not read. For a long moment nobody spoke, and Elinor felt the full weight of what she had just done settle over her like a stone. She had promised her father she would behave. She had broken that promise within the first hour of the evening over a bowl of soup. But she did not look away, and she did not take back a single word. Finally, Mr. Ashford picked his spoon back up, and to Aline's astonishment, he tasted the soup again. "You are right," he said quietly. "It is quite good. I spoke too quickly." Her father let out a breath so loud it was nearly a gasp. Elinor blinked, caught entirely off guard by the sudden shift. She had expected anger, indignation, perhaps even for the man to rise from the table and leave. Instead, he simply continued eating, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. The rest of the first course passed in an uneasy quiet, her father filling the silence with nervous conversation about trade routes and the weather. Subjects Mr. Ashford answered with short, polite responses that gave away nothing of what he was thinking. Elinor kept her eyes on her plate, replaying her own words over and over, wondering if she had ruined whatever arrangement her father had been hoping for. When the second course arrived, a roasted duck that Mrs. Dobbins had prepared with equal care, Mr. Ashford ate without complaint, though he said little. Elinor noticed him glancing at her once or twice throughout the meal, quick, assessing looks that she could not quite interpret. There was something different in the way he watched her now, something that no longer matched the cold indifference he had shown when he first arrived. By the time dessert was served, a simple tart that Elinor herself had helped prepare that afternoon, the tension in the room had eased slightly, though it never fully disappeared. Her father kept the conversation moving with practiced skill, asking about business matters that Mr. Ashford answered with careful, measured words, revealing little about himself beyond the barest facts. "You are a man of few words about your own affairs, sir," Elinor observed at one point, unable to help herself. "You know a great deal about ours, it seems, though we know almost nothing about yours." "There is not much to know," Mr. Ashford said, his tone unreadable. "I travel a great deal. I concern myself with matters of business and trade, much like your father. Beyond that, my life is rather ordinary." Elinor doubted very much that this was true, though she said nothing more on the subject. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way her father's hand still trembled slightly whenever he addressed their guest directly, that told her there was far more to this man than he was willing to share. As the evening wound toward its close, Mr. Ashford rose from the table earlier than expected, thanking her father for his hospitality in a tone that, while still formal, carried none of the coldness from earlier in the evening. "Mr. Hartley," he said, "I believe we have much to discuss regarding the matter I came to speak of. I will send word within the week." "Of course, sir, anything you require." Mr. Ashford turned to Elinor last, studying her for a long moment before speaking. "Miss Hartley," he said, "thank you for your honesty this evening. It is a rare quality, and rarer still to find it delivered with such conviction." Elinor was not certain how to respond, so she simply inclined her head. "Good evening, Mr. Ashford." He left without another word, and the moment the door closed behind him, her father sank into the nearest chair as though his legs could no longer hold him. "Elinor," he said, his voice trembling, "do you have any idea what you have done?" "I only told him the truth," she said, though her own heart was pounding now that the evening's tension had finally broken. "Was that so terrible?" Her father buried his face in his hands, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. When he finally looked up, his expression was not angry as she had expected, but something closer to disbelief, mixed with something she could not quite place. "That man," he said slowly, "was not simply a guest, Elinor. That man holds the future of this entire family in his hands, and you spoke to him as though he were a common tradesman come to argue over the price of cloth." "Then tell me who he is," Elinor said, her frustration rising once more. "You have kept his name from me all week as though it were some great secret. If I have done something terrible, at least let me understand what." Her father was quiet for a long moment, staring at the closed door as though he could still see their guest standing there. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "That man," he said, "is the Earl of Ashcombe." Elinor felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, searching for words that would not come. She thought of everything she had said that evening, every sharp word about the soup, about the roads, about his manners at their table, and felt a cold wave of horror wash over her. "The Earl," she repeated slowly, as though saying the words aloud might somehow undo them. "Yes," her father said, sinking further into his chair. The very same, and you, my dear daughter, have just spent the entire evening scolding him like a child." Alina did not sleep that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, replaying every word she had spoken at dinner, each one now carrying the weight of a mistake she could not undo. She thought of the way she had told him his complaints about the soup were beneath him, the way she had questioned why he had accepted the invitation at all if he found their hospitality so lacking. She had spoken to an Earl as though he were nothing more than a rude neighbor who had overstayed his welcome. By morning her father had barely touched his breakfast. He sat at the table with dark circles beneath his eyes, staring at nothing, while Alina picked at her own plate, unable to find her appetite either. "Father," she said finally, breaking the heavy silence between them, "what arrangement did you hope to make with him?" Her father set down his cup slowly. "The Earl of Ashcombe owns land along the northern coast, land with access to a harbor I have been trying to secure trading rights to for nearly 2 years. If he had agreed to lease me passage through his ports, it would have doubled our business within a year, perhaps more. I have written to him countless times, and he finally agreed to visit in person, to see for himself whether our family was worth the risk of his name being attached to ours." Alina felt her stomach drop further with every word. "And I have likely ruined it." "I do not know," her father admitted. "He is not a man known for his patience, nor for forgiving insult easily. There are stories about him, Alina, stories of men who crossed him in far smaller ways and found themselves without contracts, without connections, sometimes without reputation at all." "Why did he not tell us who he was from the start?" Alina asked. "Why come here pretending to be an ordinary gentleman?" Her father shook his head. "I do not know that either. Perhaps he wished to see how we behaved when we believed there was less at stake. Perhaps he wished to test whether we were the sort of family who only showed our best manners to those we knew held power over us." The thought settled uncomfortably in Alina's chest. If that had truly been his intention, then in some strange way, she had passed his test more honestly than anyone else in the house. She had not known who he was, and she had treated him exactly as she would have treated any guest who insulted her father's home and their cook's cooking. The realization did not make her feel better. If anything, it made the entire situation feel stranger, as though she had been part of some silent game she never agreed to play. 3 days passed with no word from Ashcombe House. Her father grew more anxious with each passing hour, checking the post the moment it arrived, pacing the length of his study late into the evening. Alina tried to busy herself with her usual tasks, mending, reading, helping in the kitchen, but her mind kept drifting back to the dinner table, to the flicker of surprise that had crossed the Earl's face when she first spoke to him at the bottom of the stairs. On the 4th day, a letter arrived, sealed with wax bearing an insignia Alina did not recognize. Her father's hands shook as he broke the seal, and Alina watched his face carefully as he read, trying to guess the contents before he spoke. "He wishes to continue discussions," her father said slowly, disbelief coloring his voice. "He says nothing of the dinner at all, only that he found our conversation illuminating, and that he would like to meet again to discuss the matter of the harbor rights." Relief flooded through Alina so suddenly that she had to sit down. "Then he is not angry?" "I do not know what he is," her father said, staring at the letter as though it might reveal more secrets if he looked hard enough. "But he does not sound angry, no." The meeting was arranged for the following week, this time at Ashcombe House itself, a fact that filled her father with fresh anxiety over what to wear, what to say, and whether Alina should accompany him at all. "I think it best you remain home this time," he said carefully, clearly trying not to wound her feelings. "Given what happened at dinner, I would rather not risk." "I understand," Alina said quickly, though privately she felt a strange twist of disappointment she could not fully explain. She told herself it was simply curiosity, a desire to see the grand house she had heard so much about, nothing more. Her father left early the next morning, dressed in his finest coat, his hands trembling slightly as he climbed into the hired carriage. Alina spent the day trying to distract herself, helping Mrs. Dobbins in the kitchen, mending a torn hem, reading the same page of her book at least a dozen times without absorbing a single word of it. When her father returned that evening, his expression was difficult to read, somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. "Well," Alina asked, hurrying to meet him at the door, "what happened? Did he agree to the harbor rights?" Her father removed his coat slowly, taking his time before answering, a habit Alina recognized as his way of gathering his thoughts before delivering news he was not entirely certain how to explain. He agreed, he said finally, though the conversation was unusual. Unusual how? He asked about you, her father said, watching her reaction carefully. Several times, in fact. He wished to know your age, whether you were educated, what interests you kept, whether you often spoke your mind so freely with others as you had with him. Elinor felt heat rise to her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or something else entirely, she could not say. What did you tell him? The truth, her father said, that you have always spoken your mind for better or worse, and that I have long given up trying to change it. Elinor was not certain how to feel about her father sharing such things with a man she had met only once, a man whose title alone commanded a kind of respect she still could not quite reconcile with the ordinary-looking gentleman who had complained about their soup. She busied herself preparing tea, trying to push away the strange fluttering sensation in her chest that she refused to name. 2 weeks passed with steady correspondence between her father and Ashcombe House regarding the details of the harbor agreement. Elinor overheard fragments of conversations, watched her father's mood improve with each letter that arrived, his confidence slowly returning as the arrangement took shape. She assumed her own part in the matter had ended, that whatever brief and strange attention the Earl had shown toward her had been nothing more than passing curiosity. She was wrong. On a quiet afternoon in early spring, while Elinor sat in the small garden behind their home reading beneath the shade of an old oak tree, Bridget came rushing out with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Miss Elinor," she said, breathless, "there is a carriage at the front, a very fine one, and the man inside is asking for you specifically." Elinor set down her book slowly, her heart beginning to beat faster. "Asking for me, are you certain?" "Quite certain, miss. He gave his name as Ashcombe." Elinor stood so quickly she nearly knocked over the small table beside her chair. She smoothed her skirts, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and tried to calm the sudden nervous energy coursing through her as she made her way toward the front of the house. Her father was away at the docks that afternoon, overseeing a shipment, which meant she alone would have to receive their unexpected and very important guest. She found him standing in the small entrance hall, dressed far more finely than he had been at dinner weeks before, in a dark blue coat that fit him with obvious tailoring, his dark hair neatly combed. He looked this time exactly like what he was, a man of considerable wealth and standing, and the sight of him standing so casually in their modest hall struck Elinor as strange all over again. "Lord Ashcombe," she said, curtsying carefully, uncertain of the proper etiquette but attempting her best approximation of it, "I was not expecting you. My father is away at present, but I can send word." "I did not come to see your father," he said, cutting her off with the same directness she remembered from their first meeting, though his tone now carried none of the coldness from before. "I came to see you." Elinor blinked, caught entirely off guard. "Me, for what purpose, my lord?" He studied her for a long moment before answering, his expression unreadable. "I have spent the past several weeks in the company of people who agree with everything I say the moment I say it. Men who praise my opinions before I have even finished speaking them, who apologize for the weather as though it were somehow their fault for offending me with rain. It has been, I confess, rather tiresome." Elinor did not know quite how to respond to such an admission. "I am not certain what that has to do with me, my lord." "You did not agree with me," he said simply. "Not once during the entire evening we dined together. You told me my complaints were beneath me. You defended your cook with more passion than most men defend their own honor. You asked me why I had bothered accepting an invitation I seemed determined to insult." He paused. "I have not been spoken to in such a manner in a very long time, Miss Hartley. I found I rather missed it once it was gone." Elinor felt her cheeks warm again, though this time she was not entirely certain the feeling was unpleasant. "I fear I was quite rude to you, my lord. I do not regret defending Mrs. Dobbins, but I have thought often of how sharply I spoke, and I confess I do not entirely know how to apologize for it without also taking back words I still believe were true." "Then do not apologize," he said. "I did not come here for an apology. I came because I found myself curious whether the woman who scolded me over a bowl of soup was as sharp in conversation as she was in her defense of a servant's honor, or whether that evening was simply an exception born of surprise." "And what have you concluded, my lord, standing here in my father's entrance hall?" A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, the first genuine one she had seen from him. I have concluded that I would very much like to find out properly, over conversation that does not involve soup. Elinor could not help the small laugh that escaped her, surprising even herself. That seems a reasonable enough request, my lord. Then perhaps, he said, you would allow me to call again, properly this time with your father's knowledge and blessing, so that neither of us need pretend to be someone we are not. Elinor studied him carefully, trying to reconcile the cold, critical stranger from dinner with the man standing before her now, whose eyes held something far warmer than she had expected to ever see directed at her. She thought of her father's warnings, of the rumors of a man not known for patience or forgiveness, and wondered how much of that reputation was truth and how much was simply the fear people carried toward anyone with power over their fortunes. You may call again, my lord, she said finally, though I make no promises to agree with everything you say. Good, he said, and this time his smile reached his eyes fully. I would think far less of you if you did. When her father returned that evening and learned of the visit, his reaction was not what Elinor had expected. Instead of alarm, his face broke into a slow, disbelieving smile that grew wider the more she explained. He came here to this house simply to speak with you, he asked, sitting down heavily as though the news required his full attention. He said he wished to know whether I was as sharp in conversation as I had been that night at dinner, Elinor said, still feeling somewhat dazed by the entire exchange. He asked permission to call again. Her father's smile faded slightly into something more thoughtful. Elinor, I must ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you have any interest in this man beyond what his visits might mean for our family's business? Elinor considered the question carefully before answering. I do not know him well enough yet to say, father, but I confess, there was something about our conversation today that I found unexpectedly enjoyable. He does not speak to me as though I am fragile, or as though my opinions require his permission before I share them. I have never met a man of his standing who spoke to me in such a way. Be careful, her father said, though not unkindly. Men of his rank rarely marry outside their own circle, no matter how enjoyable they find a conversation. I would not wish to see your heart given to someone who cannot, in the end, offer you what a marriage deserves. I am not giving my heart to anyone, father, Elinor said, though even as she spoke the words, she felt a small flicker of uncertainty about how true they truly were. I am simply agreeing to conversation. True to his word, Lord Ashcombe called again 3 days later, this time properly announced, arriving in the late afternoon with an invitation for Elinor and her father to join him for a walk through the public gardens near the edge of town. Her father, still slightly disbelieving of the entire situation, agreed readily, though he made a point of accompanying them himself, walking a respectful few paces behind as Elinor and the Earl spoke. You seem surprised each time I call, Ashcombe observed as they walked along a gravel path lined with early spring flowers. Did you expect me to change my mind? I expected you to grow tired of a woman who refuses to simply agree with you, Elinor said honestly. Most men do, eventually. Most men are fools, he replied simply. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who tell me what they believe I wish to hear. My tenants fear displeasing me. My peers flatter me in hopes of favor. Even my own family speaks to me with a kind of careful distance as though I might break should they say the wrong thing. He paused, glancing sideways at her. You have never once spoken to me that way. Perhaps that is because I did not know that first evening that I had any reason to fear you, Elinor admitted. Had I known you were an Earl from the moment you walked through our door, I confess I cannot promise I would have spoken so freely. And now that you know, he asked, now that the truth has been revealed, do you find yourself holding your tongue in my presence? Elinor thought about the question seriously before answering. No, she said slowly, as though testing the truth of her own words as she spoke them. I find, strangely, that I do not. He seemed pleased by this answer, though he said nothing more on the subject, instead turning the conversation toward lighter matters, asking about her interest in books, her opinions on the recent changes to trade regulations that her father had mentioned during their meeting, her thoughts on the state of the roads he had so rudely criticized during their first dinner together. I have thought often of what you said that evening, he admitted as they paused beside a small fountain, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the gravel path. About why I had bothered accepting an invitation to a home I seemed determined to insult. The truth is, Miss Hartley, I very nearly did not attend that dinner at all. Why did you, then? Curiosity, mostly, he said. Your father's letters were persistent, but there was something in his tone that differed from the usual requests I receive. He did not simply ask for favor. He spoke of his daughter, of his cook, of the pride he took in his household, even one so modest by the standards of men like myself. I found myself curious what sort of family took such pride in things most would consider beneath mention. And did you find us worthy of your curiosity, my lord? I found you far more than that, he said, his voice quieter now, more serious than before. I have attended countless dinners in homes far grander than yours, Miss Hartley, and left each one entirely unmoved. I attended yours expecting the same, and instead found myself thoroughly and completely put in my place by a woman who had no idea who I was. Elinor felt her cheeks warm once more, a sensation she was beginning to grow accustomed to in his presence. I hope you do not hold it against me still. On the contrary, he said. I have thought of little else since. Their conversation was interrupted by her father, who cleared his throat pointedly from a few paces behind, reminding them both of his presence and of the growing lateness of the hour. The walk concluded shortly after, with promises of another visit soon, and Elinor found herself replaying every word of their conversation long into the evening, unable to shake the strange warmth that had settled over her chest. Over the following weeks, Lord Ashcombe's visits became a regular occurrence, always proper, always accompanied by her father or, on occasion, by Mrs. Dobbins acting as a watchful chaperone during their walks through the garden. Word of the visits inevitably began to spread through their small circle of acquaintances, whispered conversations at the market, curious glances from neighbors who had never before paid much attention to the Hartley household. Elinor tried her best to ignore the growing gossip, though it proved increasingly difficult as the weeks passed. Margaret, her closest friend since childhood, arrived one afternoon practically bursting with questions the moment she was shown into the small parlor. Is it true, Margaret asked before she had even properly greeted Elinor, the Earl of Ashcombe himself, calling on you nearly every week? Elinor, the entire town speaks of nothing else. It is business between him and my father, Elinor said, though even as she spoke the words she knew they no longer fully explained the visits. Nothing more than that. Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. Business does not typically involve walks through the public gardens, nor does it involve a man of his rank calling personally rather than sending correspondence through proper channels. Elinor, tell me honestly, does he show interest in you beyond mere politeness? Elinor hesitated, uncertain how much of her own confused feelings she was ready to share, even with her closest friend. I do not know what to call it, Margaret. He speaks to me as though my opinions matter, as though he genuinely wishes to hear what I think rather than simply what I believe he wants to hear. I have never experienced anything quite like it. And how do you feel when he speaks to you in such a way? Elinor considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. Nervous, she admitted, but not unpleasantly so. It is a nervousness I find myself looking forward to, strange as that may sound. Margaret smiled knowingly, though she said nothing further on the matter, instead steering the conversation towards safer topics, the recent changes in fashion, the upcoming spring festival, the latest news from town. But Elinor could tell her friend's mind remained on the subject of Lord Ashcombe long after their conversation had moved elsewhere, and she suspected it would not be long before the entire town spoke openly of what still felt, to Elinor herself, like an impossible and slightly frightening possibility. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Elinor caught her own reflection in the small mirror above her dressing table and found herself studying her expression with unusual scrutiny. She thought of the way Lord Ashcombe looked at her during their walks, the genuine interest in his eyes when she spoke, the small smile that seemed to appear more easily now than it had during their first difficult meeting. She thought, too, of her father's warning, of the vast difference between their stations, of how rarely men of his rank chose to marry outside their own circle, no matter how enjoyable they found a particular conversation. She did not know what the future held, nor what Lord Ashcombe truly intended by his continued attention. But as she extinguished the candle beside her bed and settled into the darkness, she could not deny the small, persistent hope that had begun to take root somewhere deep within her chest, a hope she was not yet ready to name, but one she found herself, despite every warning and every reasonable doubt, unwilling to let go. Spring gave way slowly to early summer, and with it came a shift in the nature of Lord Ashcombe's visits. What had once been careful, Chaperoned walks through the public gardens gradually became longer conversations held in the modest parlor of the Hartley home, where he seemed increasingly content to sit for hours discussing matters far beyond business or polite small talk. Elinor found herself looking forward to his arrivals with a growing eagerness she no longer bothered denying, even to herself. Not everyone in the household shared her enthusiasm. Her father, though pleased with the steady progress of their trade agreement, grew visibly more anxious with each passing week, watching the two of them with an expression that mixed hope and worry in equal measure. "You must understand, Elinor," he said to her one evening after Ashcombe had departed, "a man such as him does not simply court a merchant's daughter without consequence. His family will expect a match befitting his station. Whatever affection may be growing between you, I fear it may end in heartbreak, for you far more than for him." "I am aware of the risk, father," Elinor said, though the words did little to ease the tightness in her chest that always seemed to appear whenever such warnings were spoken aloud. "But I cannot simply stop feeling what I feel because it may prove inconvenient." Her father sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "I only wish to protect you." "I know," she said gently, "but I am not a child, father. I understand the risks better than you might think." Despite her brave words, Elinor could not entirely silence her own doubts. She noticed, too, the way certain acquaintances had begun to treat her differently since word of the Earl's visits had spread through town. Women who had barely acknowledged her presence in years past now sought her company eagerly, hoping perhaps to glean some connection to Ashcombe House through friendship with her. Merchants who had once haggled sharply with her father over prices now offered generous terms without argument, clearly hoping to curry favor through association. It unsettled Elinor more than she cared to admit. She had spent her entire life valued, when valued at all, for her sharp mind and her willingness to speak plainly. Now, suddenly, she found herself valued for an entirely different reason, one she had no control over and had certainly never sought. She raised the matter with Lord Ashcombe during one of his visits, unable to keep the concern from her voice as she spoke. "I do not know how to feel about it," she admitted, sitting across from him in the small parlor while Bridget hovered nearby, ostensibly arranging flowers but clearly listening to every word. "People who once ignored me entirely now seek my friendship, my opinion, my company, and I cannot help but wonder how much of that interest exists only because of you." "It troubles you," he observed, watching her carefully. "Of course it troubles me," she said. "I have spent my life wishing to be valued for who I am, not for who I might know. Now I find myself surrounded by exactly the sort of flattery you told me, weeks ago, that you had grown so tired of receiving yourself." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of understanding crossing his features. "I had not considered how my presence in your life might invite that same falseness into your own experience. I am sorry for it, Elinor." It was the first time he had used her given name without title, and the sound of it in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, momentarily distracting her from the conversation at hand. "It is not your fault," she said, once she had recovered herself. "You did not ask for people to flatter me any more than you asked for them to flatter you." "No," he agreed. "But perhaps it is a fair warning of what a life closer to mine might hold for you, should things between us continue as they have been." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "I would not wish for you to lose yourself in that world, Elinor. The very quality that first drew my attention to you, that fearless honesty, is precisely what such a world tends to crush out of people over time." Elinor considered his words carefully, understanding for the first time the full weight of what he seemed to be hinting at, though neither of them had yet spoken the matter plainly. "Are you suggesting, my lord, that our continued acquaintance carries greater implications than simple friendship?" He held her gaze steadily. "I believe you already know the answer to that question, Elinor. I have called on you nearly every week for 2 months. I have walked with you through public gardens where half the town could witness us together. I have spoken to your father of matters no mere business acquaintance would ever discuss. I think we have moved well beyond simple friendship, whether either of us has been brave enough to name it plainly." Elinor's heart pounded so loudly she felt certain he must hear it from across the room. "And if I were to name it plainly, my lord, what would you have me call it?" "Courtship," he said simply, "if you are willing." The word hung in the air between them, heavier than Elinor had expected, carrying with it every warning her father had spoken, every doubt she had tried to push aside over the past 2 months. She thought of the vast gap between their stations, of the whispers that would surely grow louder should such a courtship become official, of the very real possibility that his family might never accept a merchant's daughter into their circle, no matter how deeply he cared for her. But she thought, too, of every conversation they had shared, every moment he had listened to her opinions as though they carried genuine weight, every small smile that had grown easier and more frequent with each visit. She thought of how, for the first time in her life, she had met a man who valued her sharp tongue rather than wishing to soften it into something more agreeable. "I am willing," she said finally, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt throughout her entire body. "Though I confess, my lord, I remain uncertain what such a courtship might mean for either of us, given the differences between our stations." "Let us discover that together," he said, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something close to vulnerability in his expression, a crack in the composed exterior he so carefully maintained in every other setting. "I cannot promise the path will be easy, Elinor, but I can promise it will be honest, which is more than I can say for most paths available to men of my position." When her father learned of the formal courtship that evening, his reaction was a complicated mixture of joy and continued worry, pride in his daughter's happiness warring visibly with fear for what challenges lay ahead. He said little that night beyond offering his blessing, though Elinor noticed him staring into the fire long after she had retired to bed, his expression thoughtful and distant in a way that told her his concerns had not entirely been laid to rest. News of the courtship spread through town with astonishing speed, faster even than the earlier rumors of the Earl's frequent visits. Within days, Elinor found herself the subject of conversation everywhere she went, some whispers admiring, others clearly skeptical that such a match could possibly last, still others openly resentful that a merchant's daughter should rise so unexpectedly above her station. Margaret, at least, remained a steady source of genuine happiness for her friend, though even she could not resist a knowing smile whenever the subject arose. "I told you," she said one afternoon, linking her arm through Elinor's as they walked through the market together. "I told you there was more between you than mere business." "You did," Elinor admitted, "though I confess, Margaret, I still do not fully understand how I have found myself in this position. 2 months ago I was scolding a rude stranger over a bowl of soup. Now I am courting an earl." "Life has a strange way of surprising us," Margaret said with a laugh, "though I cannot say I am surprised that your sharp tongue eventually won someone over. I always told you it would serve you well one day, even when you doubted me." Elinor laughed too, though beneath her genuine happiness, a small thread of anxiety remained, quiet but persistent, a reminder that the road ahead, however hopeful it seemed in this moment, was unlikely to remain entirely smooth. That small thread of anxiety proved well-founded sooner than Elinor had expected. Barely 2 weeks into the formal courtship, Lord Ashcombe arrived at the Hartley home with a stiffness in his posture that Elinor immediately recognized as trouble, though he tried to hide it behind his usual composed manner. "My mother has requested we visit Ashcombe House together," he said, once they had settled into the parlor. "She wishes to meet you properly." Elinor felt her stomach tighten at the news. "Does she know of our courtship?" "She has heard the rumors," he admitted. "As has most of the county, it seems. I had hoped to introduce you on my own terms, but word travels faster than I anticipated." "And what does she think of these rumors?" He hesitated, and that hesitation told Elinor more than any words could have. "My mother has certain expectations regarding who I should marry, expectations that have existed since before I was old enough to understand them myself. She will not be unkind to you, Elinor, but I would be lying if I said she will welcome this courtship with open arms." Elinor squared her shoulders, determined not to let her nervousness show. "Then I suppose I shall simply have to prove myself worth the trouble." The visit to Ashcombe House took place the following week, and Elinor spent the days leading up to it in a state of barely controlled nerves, rehearsing conversation, practicing her curtsy, agonizing over every detail of her appearance despite her father's repeated assurances that she looked lovely. Ashcombe House proved even grander than Elinor had imagined, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens and a house so large she felt certain her entire home could fit inside its entrance hall alone. She was greeted at the door by a servant who led her through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, each one seeming to watch her passage with silent judgment. The Dowager Countess of Ashcombe waited in an elegant sitting room, seated in a high-backed chair with the kind of posture that spoke of a lifetime spent commanding respect through presence alone. She was an older woman with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled back in an immaculate style, and she studied Alina with an expression that gave away nothing of her thoughts. "Miss Hartley," the Countess said, her voice cool and measured, "my son speaks of you often." "I am honored, my lady," Alina said, sinking into her most careful curtsy. "Sit," the Countess said, gesturing to a chair positioned directly across from her own, close enough that Alina felt uncomfortably exposed under the woman's scrutiny. Lord Ashcombe took a seat nearby, though the Countess's attention remained fixed entirely on Alina. "Tell me, Miss Hartley," the Countess began once tea had been served, "what exactly is it about you that has captured my son's attention so thoroughly? He has, in the past, shown little patience for courtship of any kind." Alina felt the weight of the question, understanding immediately that this was no idle inquiry but a test, much like the dinner had been weeks before. She thought of lying, of offering some polished, agreeable answer designed to please, but something in her rebelled against the very idea. "I could not say for certain, my lady," Alina answered honestly. "I did not set out to capture his attention at all. When we first met, I did not know who he was, and I spoke to him quite plainly about matters he had been rude about at my father's dinner table. I imagine that honesty, more than anything else, is what he found unusual." The Countess's eyebrow lifted slightly. "You scolded my son." "I did, my lady, though I have since come to understand who he was, and I confess I might have chosen my words more carefully had I known." "Would you have," the Countess asked, her tone sharp, "or would you have said precisely the same thing regardless?" Alina considered the question honestly before answering. "I believe I would have said the same thing, my lady, though perhaps with somewhat less heat behind it." A long silence followed, during which the Countess studied Alina with an intensity that made her want to squirm in her seat, though she forced herself to remain still and composed. Finally, the older woman turned her attention to her son. "She is exactly as strange as you described," the Countess said, though there was something almost approving in her tone that caught Alina off guard. "I told you she was unlike anyone else, mother," Lord Ashcombe said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "That much is evident," the Countess replied. She turned back to Alina. "Miss Hartley, I will be plain with you, as it seems plain speaking is a quality you value. I do not approve of this courtship. My son is meant to marry within his own circle, to a woman who understands the demands of the position he will one day fully inherit, who can navigate the expectations of society without stumbling. You are a merchant's daughter, with no training in such matters, and I fear you will find yourself entirely unprepared for the life my son's position would require of you." Alina felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and rising anger, but she kept her voice steady. "I understand your concerns, my lady, and I will not pretend I have any training in the ways of your world, but I would ask you this. If your son had wished for a wife who simply understood the rules of society and followed them without question, I do not believe he would have shown any interest in me at all. He met dozens, I imagine, of women perfectly trained for the role you describe, and yet it is a merchant's daughter who scolded him over soup that he chose to pursue." The Countess's expression flickered, something almost like surprise crossing her composed features. "You are bold, Miss Hartley." "I have been told that before, my lady," Alina said, "usually as a criticism. I hope in this case you might consider it might also be a strength." For a long moment the Countess said nothing at all, simply studying Alina with an unreadable expression. Then finally she turned back to her son. "She has more courage than most who sit in that chair," the Countess said. "I will not pretend my concerns have vanished, but I confess I understand somewhat better now why she has held your interest for so long." She turned back to Alina. "I make no promises, Miss Hartley, but I will not stand in the way of this courtship, provided you understand the difficulties that lie ahead and provided you prove yourself capable of enduring them." It was not the warm welcome Alina had hoped for, but it was far more than she had expected given the coldness of the Countess's opening questions. As the visit concluded, and Lord Ashcombe walked her back toward the waiting carriage, she felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease settle over her. "That went better than I feared," he admitted once they were alone. "My mother rarely offers even that much acknowledgement to anyone she considers unsuitable." "She still considers me unsuitable," Alina pointed out. "She simply did not forbid the courtship outright." "With my mother that is closer to approval than you might realize," he said with a small, tired laugh. "I am sorry, Alina, that you had to endure such an interrogation. I had hoped for a gentler introduction." "I would rather know honestly where I stand than be given false comfort," Alina said. "Your mother was harsh, but she was not unfair. Everything she said about the challenges ahead was true." "Does that frighten you?" Alina considered the question seriously before answering. "It does somewhat. But I find I am more frightened of losing this, of losing you, than I am of the difficulties that stand in our way. I have never been the sort of person to run from a challenge simply because it proves difficult, my lord. I do not intend to start now." He looked at her then with an expression so full of tenderness that Alina felt her breath catch in her throat. "I am beginning to believe," he said quietly, "that there is very little in this world capable of frightening you away from something you have decided to pursue." "Only very little," Alina agreed, managing a small smile despite the exhaustion of the afternoon's ordeal. "And your mother's approval, my lord, is not among the things I intend to let frighten me away." The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to Alina's life, one that mixed the familiar comforts of home with the growing, often overwhelming demands of a world she had never expected to enter. Lord Ashcombe, whom she had begun in private moments to call by his given name, Nathaniel, insisted on introducing her gradually to the wider circle of society that would one day surround her, should their courtship lead where both of them increasingly hoped it would. Her first formal event among his peers was a garden party hosted by a family friend of the Ashcombe household, an event Alina approached with far more dread than excitement. She spent hours the night before practicing the careful, measured speech expected of ladies in such circles, trying to soften the sharp edges of her natural manner of speaking into something more palatable for polite company. "You do not need to change who you are," Nathaniel told her as their carriage approached the grand estate where the party was held. "I did not ask you to court me so that you might become someone else entirely." "I know," Alina said, smoothing her skirts nervously, "but I would rather not embarrass you in front of your friends, Nathaniel. There is a difference between speaking honestly and speaking so plainly that I offend an entire garden full of guests within the first hour." "A fair distinction," he agreed, a small smile touching his mouth. "Though I suspect you will manage the difference far better than you fear." The party proved, in many ways, exactly as difficult as Alina had anticipated. She found herself surrounded by women who spoke in careful, coded language she struggled to fully interpret, compliments that carried hidden barbs, questions designed less to gather genuine information than to test her knowledge of customs she had never been taught. More than once she caught whispered conversations that stopped abruptly the moment she drew near, followed by falsely bright smiles and questions about her father's trade business, delivered in tones that made clear the questioners considered such work beneath genuine discussion. She held her composure through most of the afternoon, answering questions with careful, measured responses, deflecting pointed inquiries about her family's modest means with practiced grace she had not known she possessed until the moment demanded it. But as the afternoon wore on, she found herself increasingly exhausted by the constant effort of performing a version of herself designed to avoid giving offense. The breaking point came during a conversation with a young woman named Charlotte Ellery, whose family held considerable standing within Nathaniel's social circle. Charlotte approached Alina with a smile that did not reach her eyes, clearly having heard the rumors of the courtship and eager to test the newcomer for herself. "Miss Hartley," Charlotte said, her tone dripping with false sweetness, "how fascinating that Lord Ashcombe has taken such an interest in you. I confess I am curious what qualities a merchant's daughter might possess that our own circle has apparently failed to offer him." Alina felt the familiar heat of anger rising in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "I could not say what your circle has failed to offer him, Miss Ellery. I can only say that our conversations have never once required me to pretend interest in matters I care nothing about, nor to disguise disagreement behind false pleasantries." Charlotte's smile faltered slightly. "How refreshingly direct." "I have been told directness is one of my more notable qualities," Alina said, "along with an unfortunate tendency toward honesty, even when it proves inconvenient for the person listening." A few nearby guests, who had clearly been listening to the exchange with interest, exchanged amused glances, and Alina caught sight of Nathaniel approaching from across the garden, having overheard at least the tail end of the conversation. His expression carried a mixture of concern and something that looked distinctly like pride. "Miss Ellery," he said smoothly, joining them, I trust you are enjoying the afternoon." "Immensely, my lord," Charlotte said, recovering her composure quickly. "Your Miss Hartley has proven quite entertaining company." "She proves entertaining company to everyone she meets," Nathaniel said, "whether they wish her to or not." He offered Elena his arm, a small gesture that felt in that moment like a public declaration far more powerful than any words could have conveyed. "If you will excuse us, I believe there are several other guests eager to make Miss Hartley's acquaintance." As they walked away from Charlotte's increasingly strained smile, Elena let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "I fear I have made an enemy within the first hour of my first proper social event." "Charlotte Ellery makes enemies of most people eventually," Nathaniel said dismissively. "She has long harbored hopes regarding my own attention, hopes I have never once encouraged. I suspect her sharp questions had less to do with genuine curiosity about your character and more to do with jealousy over what she has failed to secure for herself." "That does not entirely ease my worry," Elena admitted. "If I am to move within this world, Nathaniel, I fear I will make many such enemies before I learn how to navigate it properly." "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "but you will also make allies in time among those who value the same honesty I first found so compelling in you. Not everyone in my circle is as small-minded as Miss Ellery, though I confess she represents a larger portion of it than I would prefer." Despite the tension of the afternoon, the garden party ultimately proved less disastrous than Elena had feared, and by its conclusion, she found herself in conversation with several guests who seemed genuinely interested in her perspective, drawn perhaps by curiosity over the woman who had so thoroughly captured Lord Ashcombe's attention, or perhaps simply by her refreshing willingness to speak plainly in a world so often built on careful evasion. Over the following weeks, similar events followed, each one bringing its own particular challenges, its own small victories and small defeats. Elena slowly began to develop a kind of fluency in navigating this new world, learning when to hold her tongue and when to let it speak freely, learning which battles were worth fighting and which were better left alone. Through it all, Nathaniel remained a steady presence beside her, never once asking her to abandon the very qualities that had drawn him to her in the first place, even as she gradually learned to temper those qualities with the diplomatic skill the world increasingly demanded of her. Their conversations, held in quieter moments away from the watchful eyes of society, remained the same honest, unguarded exchanges that had first brought them together, and Elena found in those private moments a refuge from the exhausting performance required of her in public. "I do not know how you endure this constantly," she admitted to him one evening, as they sat together in her father's small garden, the summer air warm and heavy with the scent of blooming flowers. "The careful words, the hidden meanings, the constant awareness of who is watching and what they might think." "I have had a lifetime to grow accustomed to it," Nathaniel said, "though I confess, watching you navigate it these past weeks has reminded me how exhausting it truly is, a fact I had perhaps grown too numb to notice on my own." "Does it never grow easier?" "Somewhat," he admitted, "though I do not believe it ever grows entirely comfortable, not for someone who values honesty as deeply as you do. I only hope, Elena, that whatever discomfort this world causes you proves worth enduring for what lies on the other side of it." Elena reached for his hand, a small gesture that had become increasingly natural between them over the preceding weeks. "I believe it will be," she said quietly, "though I confess, some days prove more difficult to believe that than others." As summer stretched onward, whispers about the courtship grew louder, spreading well beyond the boundaries of their own small town into the wider circles of society that Nathaniel moved within. What had once been isolated gossip among neighbors and market vendors had transformed into a topic of genuine fascination among the aristocracy, curious and often skeptical about the merchant's daughter, who had captured the notice of one of the county's most eligible and famously guarded noblemen. Eleanor's father, watching the growing attention with a mixture of pride and worry, found himself increasingly courted by other merchants and businessmen eager to associate themselves with a family suddenly connected, however tentatively, to Ashcombe House. Offers of partnership arrived at their door with growing frequency, terms far more generous than anything he had received in the years before Nathaniel's first visit. "I do not know whether to feel grateful for these opportunities," her father confessed one evening, staring at a stack of correspondence spread across his desk, "or troubled by how quickly they arrived once your courtship became known. I built this business through years of honest labor, Elena, and now I find doors opening simply because of who my daughter happens to be courting. Does that trouble you greatly, father? It troubles me because I fear for what happens should the courtship end, he admitted. These new partners, these generous terms, they exist because of Nathaniel's name attached to ours, however loosely. Should that connection disappear, I suspect these same doors would close as quickly as they opened. Elena understood his concern, though she tried not to let it weigh too heavily on her own growing anxieties. She had begun, in recent weeks, to notice a subtle shift in how people treated her, an eagerness in their attention that felt less like genuine interest and more like calculated positioning, hopeful investment in a connection that might one day prove profitable. The realization left her feeling increasingly uncertain about which relationships in her life remained genuine, and which had been shaped, consciously or not, by her association with Nathaniel's name. This growing unease came to a head during a conversation with Margaret, whose friendship Elena had always trusted implicitly, but whose recent behavior had begun to carry a strange new quality that troubled her deeply. "You must introduce me to some of his friends," Margaret said one afternoon, her tone carrying an eagerness Elena had not noticed in their friendship before. "Surely, among his circle, there must be eligible gentlemen who would appreciate a woman of good character, even one without noble blood." "Margaret," Elena said slowly, "is that truly why you have been spending so much time with me these past weeks, for introductions to Nathaniel's circle?" Margaret's face flushed, caught off guard by the direct question. "That is not the only reason, Elena, of course not. But I would be lying if I said the possibility had not crossed my mind. You cannot fault me for hoping some good fortune might come my way as well, given our long friendship." Elena felt a familiar ache settle in her chest, the same uncomfortable realization she had experienced weeks before with the sudden flattery of former acquaintances. Even Margaret, her oldest and dearest friend, had not remained entirely immune to the pull of opportunity that Nathaniel's attention had brought into Elena's life. "I understand your hope," Elena said carefully, trying to keep the hurt from her voice. "But I would ask that our friendship remain something separate from whatever connections it might bring you. I value you for who you are, Margaret, not for what you might gain through knowing me, and I had hoped you valued me the same way." Margaret's expression softened with genuine remorse. "Forgive me, Elena, you are right and I spoke thoughtlessly. Our friendship has always mattered to me far more than any connection it might bring. I allowed the excitement of your situation to cloud my judgment, and I am sorry for it." Though the conversation ended with reconciliation, Elena found herself carrying a new wariness in the days that followed, a growing difficulty in distinguishing genuine affection from calculated opportunity in nearly every interaction she had. Even her own growing feelings for Nathaniel became tangled in doubt during her quieter, more anxious moments, when she found herself wondering whether her father's improved business fortunes had somehow influenced her own willingness to pursue the courtship, whether some small, unacknowledged part of her had been swayed by the practical benefits as much as by genuine affection. She raised these doubts with Nathaniel during one of their private evening conversations, unable to keep the worry from spilling out despite her usual reluctance to burden him with her insecurities. "I begin to wonder," she admitted, staring at her hands rather than meeting his eyes, "whether people can tell the difference anymore between who values me for myself and who values me for what I might bring them through connection to you. Even my closest friend has proven uncertain on this point. I fear, Nathaniel, that I have lost the ability to trust my own judgment regarding who genuinely cares for me and who merely hopes to benefit from proximity to your name." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the seriousness she had come to appreciate in him. "I understand that fear better than you might realize," he said finally. "I have lived my entire life uncertain whether those around me valued my company or simply valued my title and the influence it carries. It is a lonely uncertainty to live with, and I am sorry that my presence in your life has brought that same uncertainty into yours." "It is not your fault," Elena said quickly. "I do not regret our courtship, Nathaniel. I only find myself increasingly troubled by how difficult it has become to trust the intentions of those around me." "Then trust this," he said, taking her hand gently in his own. "I fell for a woman who scolded me over a bowl of soup before she ever learned my title, a woman who spoke her mind without a single thought toward what benefit such honesty might bring her. Whatever doubts you carry about others, Elena, Do not let them convince you to doubt the origin of what exists between us. I know, better than anyone, that your affection for me began long before you had any reason to hope for gain from it." His words offered some comfort, though Eleanor's underlying unease did not entirely disappear. She found herself, in the weeks that followed, growing more careful in her interactions with others, more attentive to the subtle signs of calculated interest that she had once been too trusting to notice. It was an uncomfortable lesson, one that stripped away some of the innocent openness that had once defined her approach to the world, replaced by a wearier, more guarded wisdom she had not asked for but could no longer avoid. The one relationship that remained entirely untouched by this growing wariness was her connection with Nathaniel himself, whose consistency and honesty throughout every difficulty of the preceding months had earned a trust in Eleanor's heart that no amount of outside doubt could shake. Whatever complications their courtship had introduced into the rest of her life, the certainty of his affection remained the one steady anchor she could rely upon, even as everything else around her grew increasingly uncertain. As autumn approached, the growing weight of doubt and outside scrutiny finally reached a point that Eleanor could no longer simply push aside. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, during a quiet visit from Nathaniel that had, until that point, followed the same comfortable rhythm their private conversations always did. But something in Eleanor's mind had been building for days, a question she had avoided asking directly, though it had haunted her thoughts with increasing persistence. "Nathaniel," she said finally, setting down her teacup with careful precision, "I must ask you something, and I need you to answer with complete honesty, whatever the answer may be." He set down his own cup, giving her his full attention. "Of course. When you first arrived at my father's dinner that evening," she said slowly, "before you knew how I would speak to you, before any of this began, what did you truly expect to find? Were you already searching for a wife among merchant families, or was our meeting simply an accident of business that happened to lead somewhere neither of us anticipated?" "I do not understand the purpose of this question," he said, though his expression suggested he understood far more than he claimed. "I need to understand," Eleanor pressed, "whether your interest in me began because of something genuine you saw in that moment, or whether it grew slowly out of convenience, out of the ease with which our courtship has benefited both our families. I have spent months now surrounded by people whose affection I cannot fully trust, people who value me only for what proximity to your name might offer them. I find myself, more and more, wondering if perhaps you began seeing something similar in me, something useful rather than something genuinely wanted." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor felt her heart pounding as she waited for his response, uncertain whether she truly wanted to hear whatever answer he might give. "I will tell you exactly what I felt that evening," he said finally, his voice steady and sincere. "I arrived at your father's home expecting precisely what I had experienced at 100 other dinners before it. Careful flattery, nervous hosts eager to please me, a daughter paraded before me as a potential match, dressed and coached to say exactly what she believed I wished to hear. I expected boredom, Eleanor, the same tedious boredom I had grown accustomed to expecting from every social obligation attached to my title. And instead I found a woman who told me my complaints about her cooked soup were beneath me," he said, a small smile touching his mouth despite the seriousness of the conversation. "A woman who defended a servant's honor with more passion than I had ever heard anyone defend anything in my presence. I was not searching for a wife that evening, Eleanor. I was searching, if I am honest, for nothing at all beyond the completion of a tedious business obligation. What I found instead was entirely unexpected, and it had nothing to do with convenience or benefit. It had everything to do with the simple fact that you did not know who I was, and you spoke to me exactly as you would have spoken to anyone else who insulted your family's hospitality." Eleanor felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back, still needing to understand fully before she allowed herself to believe. You are certain this was never about what our families might gain from such a connection?" "I am certain," he said, reaching for her hand. "Eleanor, I have met countless women who knew from the very first moment who I was, and every single one of them shaped their behavior around that knowledge, whether consciously or not. You alone treated me as an ordinary man because in that moment that was exactly what you believed me to be. That is why I first respected you, and it is that same fearless honesty that I have come to love more deeply with each passing month since. Whatever benefits our courtship has brought to your father's business, whatever calculated interest others have shown toward you because of my name, None of that changes the truth of how this began between us, or the truth of what I feel for you now." Elinor felt the weight of months of accumulated doubt begin to lift from her chest, replaced by a warmth that spread through her entire body at his words. "I needed to hear that," she admitted. "I have spent so long uncertain whether anything in my life since that dinner has been genuine, that I nearly lost sight of the one truth that mattered most." "And what truth is that?" "That you loved me before you ever had reason to expect anything from me," she said softly. "That the very first thing you knew about me was simply that I would not bend to flatter you, even when I had every reason to fear the consequences of speaking my mind." "That is the truth," he confirmed, "and it is a truth I intend to hold on to for the rest of my life, should you allow me the privilege of doing so." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, and Elinor felt her breath catch entirely as he opened it to reveal a ring, simple and elegant, clearly chosen with careful thought rather than mere extravagance. "Elinor Hartley," he said, his voice carrying a vulnerability she had rarely seen from him, even in their most private moments together, "I do not ask you to marry me because of what our union might bring to either of our families, nor because society now expects it of us after months of courtship. I ask you because I have never once in my entire life met anyone who made me feel more genuinely myself than you do, simply by refusing to let me hide behind my title. Will you marry me?" Elinor did not need to consider her answer, though her heart pounded so fiercely she could barely find her voice to speak it. "Yes," she said, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, tears of joy rather than doubt. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger with careful, trembling hands, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, simply sitting together in the quiet comfort of the small parlor where their courtship had first properly begun, months earlier, following a dinner where Elinor had scolded a rude stranger without any idea that he was the Earl. When her father learned the news that evening, his reaction was everything Elinor had hoped for and more, tears of genuine happiness mixing with the relief of a father who had worried, for months, that his daughter's heart might be broken by a world so different from her own. "I am proud of you," he said, embracing her tightly. "Not simply for the match you have made, Elinor, but for who you remained throughout it all. You did not change yourself to win his affection. You won it simply by being exactly who you have always been." Word of the engagement spread through the county with even greater speed than the rumors of courtship had before it, and while Elinor knew that whispers, both admiring and skeptical, would continue to follow her for the rest of her life among Nathaniel's circle, she found she no longer feared them as she once had. She had learned, through months of doubt and difficulty, exactly which relationships in her life held genuine value, and she carried that hard-won wisdom forward into her new life, with a confidence that no amount of outside judgment could shake. The wedding, held the following spring in the gardens of Ashcombe House, was a quiet affair by the standards of the aristocracy, attended by close family and the small circle of genuine friends who had proven their loyalty long before any title had entered the picture. Mrs. Dobbins, whose soup had unknowingly started the entire story, prepared a portion of the wedding feast at Elinor's insistence, and Nathaniel made a point, during his toast, of publicly thanking her for the meal that had first brought Elinor into his life. "I fell in love," he told the gathered guests, raising his glass with a smile that held none of the coldness he had once carried into that first dinner, "with a woman who scolded me for insulting her cook's cooking, without any idea that I was the Earl she was speaking to so plainly. I have never been more grateful for a bowl of soup in my entire life." Laughter rippled through the gathered guests, and Elinor, standing beside him in the golden light of the spring afternoon, felt a happiness so complete it seemed to fill every corner of her being. She thought back to that first nervous evening, to her father's frantic warnings, to the rude stranger who had criticized their roads and their home within moments of walking through the door, and she could not help but marvel at how far a single moment of honest, unguarded speech had carried her, into a life she never could have imagined for herself, built not on flattery or calculation, but on the simple, enduring foundation of two people who had chosen each other exactly as they were. The years that followed their marriage brought their own share of challenges, though Elinor faced each one with the same steady honesty that had carried her through the difficult months of courtship. She never fully abandoned her sharp tongue, nor did Nathaniel ever ask her to. Instead, she learned to wield it with growing wisdom, knowing precisely when plain speech served her best, and when patience proved the wiser course. a balance that took years to master fully but one that never required her to lose the essential core of who she was. The Dowager Countess, whose early skepticism had never entirely vanished, grew to respect her daughter-in-law over time, watching with quiet approval as Elinor navigated the demands of her new position without ever losing the qualities that had first unsettled the older woman. Their relationship remained one of careful mutual respect rather than warmth, but it was respect earned honestly, through years of demonstrated character rather than empty flattery, and Elinor came to value it precisely because of how difficult it had been to win. Charlotte Ellery, whose sharp questions had marked Elinor's first difficult introduction to society, eventually married elsewhere, and though their relationship never grew close, the years softened the edges of their early rivalry into something closer to distant civility. Elinor learned in time that not every difficult relationship required resolution to be left behind peacefully, and she found a measure of peace in simply letting go of grievances that no longer served any purpose in her life. Margaret's friendship, tested so severely in those early uncertain months, grew stronger rather than weaker once the initial confusion of Elinor's changed circumstances had settled. Margaret eventually found her own happiness, not through any connection Elinor provided, but through her own persistence and character, marrying a kind-hearted solicitor whose steady affection matched her own warm nature. The two women remained close friends for the rest of their lives, their bond ultimately strengthened rather than broken by the trials it had endured. Elinor's father, whose trade business had flourished considerably following the harbor agreement with Ashcombe House, never lost his humble roots despite his growing fortune. He continued overseeing his shipments personally well into his later years, refusing every suggestion that he hire others to handle the work he had always taken pride in doing himself. He often told the story of that first fateful dinner to anyone willing to listen, delighting in the retelling each time, always ending with the same proud declaration that his daughter's sharp tongue had, against every expectation, secured the family's fortune far more effectively than any careful diplomacy ever could have. Mrs. Dobbins remained with the household for many years afterward, her soup recipe becoming something of a legend within the family, requested at every important gathering that followed, always met with the same appreciative praise that had once been so conspicuously absent from that first difficult dinner. Elinor made certain, throughout every year of her marriage, that the woman who had unknowingly played such a central role in her story was never forgotten nor undervalued. As for Elinor and Nathaniel themselves, their marriage grew steadily richer with each passing year, built on the same foundation of honest conversation that had first drawn them together. They raised their children with the same values that had shaped Elinor's own character, teaching them that honesty, however inconvenient it might occasionally prove, remained far more valuable than the hollow comfort of careful flattery. Their home, whether at Ashcombe House or during their frequent visits to the modest house where Elinor had grown up, remained a place where plain speech was always welcomed and never punished, a rare quality in a world so often built on careful pretense. Years later, when their eldest daughter asked how her parents had first met, Elinor would tell the story exactly as it happened, without embellishment, delighting in her daughter's wide-eyed astonishment each time she reached the part where she had scolded her own father over a bowl of soup, without any idea that he held a title at all. "Were you not frightened?" her daughter once asked, speaking so boldly to a stranger who could have ruined your family's fortune with a single word. "I did not know at the time that such ruin was even possible," Elinor admitted with a fond smile, "but I do not believe knowing would have changed what I said. Some truths simply need to be spoken, regardless of the consequences they might bring." It was a lesson Elinor carried with her throughout her entire life, one she passed down faithfully to each of her children in turn, a reminder that genuine connection could never be built on careful pretense, no matter how comfortable such pretense might initially seem. The rude stranger who had once complained about her father's roads and her cook's cooking had, in the end, become the truest partner she could have ever hoped to find, precisely because she had never once tried to be anyone other than exactly who she was. And so the story that began with a single sharp word spoken in anger over a bowl of soup became, in time, the foundation of a lifelong love, proof that honesty, however unwelcome it might seem in the moment it is spoken, often carries within it the seeds of something far more lasting and true than any careful flattery ever could.